On the afternoon of September 11, 1697 on the Tisza River, a pontoon bridge assembled from 60 boats collapsed beneath the weight of thousands of people desperately trying to escape. Less than 3 hours later, more than 20,000 Ottoman soldiers were dead. Some modern historical music sources place the figure at nearly 30,000, including those killed, wounded, and drowned. More than 10,000 of them did not die by the sword, but drowned in the cold waters of the Tisza River before the very eyes of their comrades. On the other side, the Habsburg army, the force that had just inflicted this disaster, suffered fewer than 500 casualties. That disparity was more than a victory. It was a systematic music massacre. In the span of a single afternoon, an army belonging to an empire that had made Europe tremble for 3 centuries, was almost completely annihilated. The Grand Vizier, the second most powerful figure in the Ottoman Empire, was killed on the riverbank. The Sultan's entire treasury, the imperial seal, and more than 200 cannons fell into enemy hands. This was the Battle of Zenta, a massacre on the banks of the Tisza River that changed the course of European history. What truly led to the tragedy of that day? To understand why one afternoon beside the Tisza River mattered so much, we must go back 14 years. In 1683, the Ottoman army laid siege to Vienna, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire and the heart of Habsburg power. This was the deepest Ottoman advance into the heart of music Central Europe since their expansion had begun. Had Vienna fallen, the entire political map of Europe might have been transformed. For more than 3 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had scarcely paused its westward advance. From this conquest of Constantinople in 1453, which brought the Byzantine Empire to an end, to the subjugation of most of the Balkans and Hungary, their borders had only expanded, music never contracted. To much of Christian Europe, the Ottomans were not merely a military adversary. They were a force that seemed impossible to stop. But the siege failed. A relief army, including Polish cavalry under King John III Swas, defeated the Ottomans at the very gates of the city. It was the first major turning point. From that defeat, a new alliance was born, the Holy League, bringing together the Habsburg Empire, Poland, Lithuania, the Republic Music of Venice, and later Russia. The alliance aimed not merely to defend itself, but to drive the Ottomans from lands they had occupied for centuries. This conflict became known as the Great Turkish War, lasting from 1683 to 1699. In the early years, the Habsburgs won victory after victory. They recaptured Buda in 1686, the former capital of Hungary, which had remained in Ottoman hands for 145 years. In 1687, they won a crushing victory at Mohat, the very place where the Ottomans had defeated Hungary in 1526, opening the way for their occupation of the region. In 1688, Belgrade fell to the Habsburg army, but the advance did not last forever. The Ottomans reorganized their army under a new and more capable Grand Vizier. In 1690, they recaptured Belgrade. The war entered a period of stalemate. In 1694, the Habsburgs attacked Belgrade for a second time, but failed. And then something unusual happened in Istanbul. A young sultan decided to lead his army into battle in person, something Ottoman sultans had not done for decades. Mustafa II ascended the throne in 1695 as the empire sank deeper into a military crisis on multiple fronts. North of the Black Sea, Russia under Peter the Great had just captured the fortress of Ozov in 1696, a strategic gateway to the sea that the Ottomans had controlled for generations. In the west, the Ottomans' only remaining ally France, under Louis XIV, was moving closer to a separate peace agreement with the European powers, meaning the Ottomans were about to lose their last music source of diplomatic support. Unlike most of his predecessors who had remained inside the palace, Mustafa II decided to take the field himself in 1695 and music 1696. He personally commanded his forces and won 3 consecutive victories over the Habsburgs at Lugos, Yulash, and Senator. These victories partially restored Ottoman military prestige and strengthened Mustafa III's image as a warrior king. But those 3 victories led Mustafa II to believe something dangerous: that the Habsburg army was no longer strong enough to stop him from advancing into Transylvania. In 1697, he prepared a larger campaign and advanced deep into Transylvania, the wealthy territory east of Hungary, where the Habsburgs and Ottomans had competed for influence for years. This was not an impulsive attack. The Ottoman army departed from Belgrade and marched along the Danube before making a detour to seize the fortress of Titel at the confluence of the Tisza and Danube rivers. When they discovered that the fortress had no garrison, They destroyed it and continued northward along the right bank of the Tisza River. The Tisza River was the last major natural barrier before they could enter Transylvania. Once across it, the Ottomans would open the way deep into territory the Habsburgs considered vital to their sphere of influence. But Mustafa II did not know one thing. There was a new Habsburg commander, and he would not allow him that opportunity. On July 5, 1697, a nobleman of French-Italian origin was appointed commander-in-chief of the Habsburg army in Hungary. His name was Eugene of Savoy. This was the first time Eugene had been given independent command of a major campaign. He already had battlefield experience, but he had never before carried sole responsibility for the fate of an entire army. And what he inherited was far from easy. On paper, the army under his command numbered approximately 70,000 men. In reality, only around half of them were ready for battle. Discipline was poor. The imperial treasury was exhausted and wages were not paid regularly. Emperor Leopold I, the ruler of the Habsburg Empire, urged Eugene to act cautiously, avoiding the risk of a major battle that could cause the entire front to collapse if it ended in defeat. But Eugene possessed what even an undisciplined army still needed: experienced subordinate commanders, including Guido Starberg and Sigbert Heistester, as well as the ability to reorganize his forces within a short time. He gathered the scattered units and consolidated them into an army of approximately 50,000 to 55,000 battle-ready men, including 34,000 infantrymen, 16,000 cavalrymen, and 60 field guns. This army did not consist solely of Austrians. It was a characteristically multithnic force of the Habsburg Empire. German soldiers, Hungarian nobles loyal to the imperial court, and Serbian militia under the leader Jovan Popović Tečika. Men who had their own reasons to despise Ottoman rule. It was not an army united by language or origin. The only thing holding them in the music-same ranks was the threat advancing from the south. The situation was further complicated by an internal factor. Not all Hungarians supported the Habsburgs. A group of Hungarian rebels known as the Kurik, led by Imre Turki, had allied themselves with the Ottomans against the very Habsburg court to which they were supposedly subject. This was a war not only between two empires, but one interwoven with complex internal conflicts within the very lands where the fighting took place. With a hastily assembled army short of money, lacking discipline, and burdened by an order from above to be cautious, Eugene of Savoy began his pursuit of the Sultan's army. Throughout the summer of 1697, Eugene closely followed the Ottoman army without confronting it directly. He marched from Petrovaradin, crossed the Tisza River, and then advanced along its eastern bank, always remaining close enough to observe, but far enough away to avoid a battle he was not yet in a position to win. The problem was this: the Ottomans had no idea that the Habsburg army was so close. Sultan Mustafa II believed the enemy was still far away and continued marching toward Zenta, preparing to cross the Tisza River and advance into Transylvania. This was the moment when the entire campaign could turn in one of two completely different directions. If Eugene continued to act cautiously, as Emperor Leopold II had ordered, the Ottomans would cross the river safely, advance into Transylvania, and prolong the war for at least another campaign season, perhaps longer. If Eugene chose to attack and failed, he could lose his entire army and his career could end during his very first campaign under independent command. The turning point came from a specific piece of intelligence. Habsburg scouts captured an Ottoman prisoner. He revealed that the Ottoman infantry had not yet completed the crossing. While the cavalry had already reached the opposite bank, most of the infantry remained stranded on the western side, protected only by a line of wagons arranged as a temporary barricade rather than by solid fortifications. In other words, the Sultan's vast army had been divided in two by the very river it intended to cross. One half had crossed. The other remained trapped and exposed without a strong defensive line. This was the kind of opportunity a military commander might wait an entire career to encounter. But seizing it meant openly defying the emperor's order to exercise caution. If he failed, Eugene would face not only military defeat, but possible prosecution for disobeying orders. Eugene chose to act. He ordered a forced march to reach the Ottoman crossing point before they could complete the transfer of their entire force to the opposite bank. On the morning of September 11, 1697, the Ottoman army had reached the area near the village of Zenta on the banks of the Tisza River. Completely unaware that the Habsburg army was closing in, only a few hours' march away. Just downstream from Zenta, a long strip of land rose from the middle of the Tisza River, an ideal location for building a bridge. French military engineers serving in the Sultan's army began constructing a long pontoon bridge assembled from 60 long boats fastened together with leather ropes and covered with wooden planks so that men and horses could cross. Most of the Ottoman troops did not camp directly beside the river, but farther inland, forming a defensive ring of wagons, a type of field fortification commonly used by steppe armies. The bridge head, where the military supplies were stored, was more heavily protected. It was surrounded by a trench approximately 150 m long with another wagon barricade inside. By midday on September 11th, the crossing was partially complete. Most of the cavalry and part of the infantry had reached the eastern bank and were heading toward Transylvania. But the remaining infantry, still a vast force, remained trapped on the western bank, waiting for their turn to cross. This was the precise moment when the army became naturally divided by the very act of crossing the river. One half of the force was already on the opposite side, unable to provide immediate support. The other half was congested on the near bank, exposed on open ground and protected only by a makeshift line of wagons, not a defensive position capable of withstanding a large-scale assault. And they had no idea that tens of thousands of Habsburg troops were approaching from only a short distance away. Part 7. The Battle of Zenta. Around the middle of the afternoon on September 11, 1697, the Habsburg army came into view of the Ottoman forces. It was a complete surprise. Sultan Mustafa II and his commanders were entirely unprepared for a battle at that moment. As the Habsburg ranks and banners began to appear on the horizon, a wave of dread swept through the Ottoman camp on the western bank. Alarm trumpets tore through the afternoon air. Many Ottoman soldiers had still been resting, believing they merely had to wait for their turn to cross. But now they scrambled for their weapons in utter disbelief. Ottoman officers shouted frantically, trying to arrange the Janissary infantry into formation and move the artillery into firing positions. But the space inside the ring of wagon fortifications was too confined, preventing the infantry formations from deploying into lines where they could bring their firepower to bear. While the heavy cannons became hopelessly trapped among the crowd, Eugene wasted no time on further deliberation. He ordered his forces to deploy for an attack that very afternoon. It was a bold decision because attacking late in the day meant that if the battle continued, his men would have to fight in darkness on unfamiliar ground. But he understood clearly. Every passing hour gave the Ottomans more time to complete the crossing and strengthen their defenses. The opportunity existed only in that moment. The Habsburg army was deployed in a vast arc. The right wing pressed close to the banks of the Tisza River, tasked with sealing off the Ottoman retreat toward the pontoon bridge. The left wing extended far across the plain, reaching as widely as possible with the aim of encircling the entire Ottoman position on the western bank. It was a classic encirclement, not merely attacking from the front, but closing in from both sides to deny the enemy any escape. The Habsburg artillery opened fire first. It was an experienced artillery force, far better trained than its Ottoman counterpart at this stage of the war. Cannon fire slammed directly into the Ottoman troops clustered near the bridge. The most densely crowded area where thousands of men waited for their turn to cross with no room to spread out. Iron cannonballs tore through the tightly packed formations, inflicting devastating casualties within the first few volleys. Immediately after the bombardment, several regiments of Habsburg dragoons dismounted and advanced toward the trench's infantry, launching a direct assault on the defensive line. Here, the Ottoman troops mounted fierce resistance. Janissaries sheltering behind the wagons fired continuously, creating a wall of gunfire that repelled the first Habsburg charge. Several Austrian regiments were forced to withdraw and reorganize before the trench. The Ottoman defensive line only truly began to collapse when the Habsburg left wing broke through the gap between the Ottoman left flank and the bridge. This calculated strike completely severed the only route of retreat for the thousands of soldiers still trapped on the western bank. From that moment onward, the battle no longer unfolded like an ordinary engagement. The Ottoman army was now completely surrounded. The Ottoman troops behind the field fortifications began to break. When they realized that their defensive line had been breached and their retreat cut off, military discipline disintegrated completely. The difference between an organized withdrawal and a fleeing mob is this. A withdrawal requires supporting lines to cover the retreat, while a rout leaves only the instinct to survive. Thousands of men threw down their weapons and surged toward the pontoon bridge. Under normal conditions, the bridge was only wide enough for a single orderly stream of men and horses. Now, thousands were attempting to force their way onto it at once. Habsburg artillery continued firing directly at the bridge and riverbank, the most densely packed area on the entire battlefield. It was amid this chaos that Grand Vizier Elmas Mehmed Pasha, the highest-ranking military commander on the battlefield and the second most powerful figure in the Ottoman state after the Sultan, was killed. According to some historical accounts, while attempting to stop the fleeing masses, he was killed by his own soldiers in the midst of the chaos. The pontoon bridge, built to carry the army safely across the river, had now become a death trap. Under the weight of too many people trying to force their way across at once, the structure assembled from 60 boats began to break apart. Entire sections of the bridge collapsed while still packed with people. Thousands of soldiers plunged directly into the waters of the Tisza River. This was the crucial moment that set the Battle of Zenta apart from most other battles of the same war. Most of the casualties did not come from direct combat, but from the attempt to escape. Those who could swim struggled against the powerful current, surrounded by the bodies of their comrades and fragments of the shattered bridge. Those who could not swim had almost no chance at all. According to Habsburg reports, more than 10,000 men drowned while attempting to cross the river and escape. A figure counting only those who died in the water, not those killed on the riverbank. Meanwhile, the Ottoman cavalry that had already reached the eastern bank could do almost nothing to intervene. The river between them, combined with the extraordinary speed at which the western defenses collapsed, left them able only to watch from a distance as the rest of their army was annihilated. From the eastern bank, Sultan Mustafa II witnessed the entire catastrophe. He escaped with part of his force, but was forced to watch most of his army collapse within a matter of hours. An experience no Ottoman Sultan had been forced to confront personally on the battlefield for generations. The main battle from the moment the Habsburg artillery opened fire until the entire Ottoman defensive line completely collapsed lasted less than 2 hours. But its consequences would shape the balance of power in Europe for decades to come as darkness fell over the Tisza River. The Habsburg army stood upon a battlefield where the enemy had almost no remaining ability to organize a counterattack. All that remained was to deal with the aftermath of one of the most devastating military defeats in the history of the Ottoman Empire. When the first light of September 12 fell upon the banks of the Tisza River, the true scale of the catastrophe became fully visible. The calm morning waters stood in brutal contrast to the sight of tens of thousands of bodies drifting toward both banks, entangled in the wreckage of the fateful pontoon bridge. Thin smoke still hovered above the devastated encampment. Amid shattered wagons, abandoned weapons, and the traces of the previous night's rout. According to the official report of the Holy League, the Habsburgs lost only 429 men killed and 1,598 wounded. It was an extraordinarily small figure for a battle that had just destroyed most of an enemy army. This astonishing disparity resulted from the nature of the Battle of Zenta. The Habsburgs did not have to endure the losses of a prolonged and bitter close-quarters struggle. Thanks to Eugene's tactical insight, they struck at the precise moment when the enemy was most vulnerable, transforming the battle into an encirclement dominated by overwhelming firepower from one side. As for the Ottomans, casualty estimates vary between sources, but all of them reflect a catastrophic level of loss. Some contemporary Ottoman chronicles recorded approximately 7,000 to 8,000 casualties, but most modern historical research, drawing upon a combination of sources, presents a much higher figure. More than 20,000 dead, with some estimates placing the combined total of those killed, wounded, and drowned at nearly 30,000. This discrepancy arose partly because Ottoman court chroniclers tended to downplay the scale of the defeat in an attempt to conceal a shock too immense to acknowledge. When the Habsburg troops poured into the enemy encampment, what they captured carried not only military significance, but profound symbolic meaning. The entire Ottoman field artillery force, approximately 200 guns, fell into enemy hands, meaning that the surviving forces were left with almost no means of establishing a meaningful defensive line in the immediate future. The Sultan's personal treasury was also captured along with thousands of livestock, hundreds of wagons carrying provisions, and luxurious equipment that had been prepared for a prolonged campaign. But the most symbolically significant prize was a small object found beside the body of the Grand Vizier, the seal of the Ottoman Empire. This object represented the authority and legitimacy of the central government, and was used to authenticate the highest imperial decrees. For this seal to fall into the hands of a European army was unprecedented in Ottoman military history. It was not merely a valuable trophy of war. It was a profound symbolic shock, revealing the collapse not only of an army, but of an illusion of invincibility that had endured for more than 3 centuries. On the opposite bank, Sultan Mustafa II and the surviving remnants of his cavalry were forced to retreat in chaos, heading toward the region of Timisoara to prepare for the winter. The army that had set out with the ambition of conquering Transylvania now returned with its organization, almost music, entirely destroyed. With no supply wagons and no artillery remaining, the valiant sultan who had sworn to avenge the empire was now forced to music, endure the bitterness of a humiliating retreat. By contrast, for Eugene of Savoy, this absolute victory immediately made him one of the most admired military commanders in Europe. From a general who had faced the risk of prosecution for openly disobeying orders, he had used victory to prove that his decision had been right. Zenta marked the beginning of a series of military successes that would continue for decades throughout his career, elevating Eugene to the ranks of the greatest strategists in European history. The Battle of Zenta did not end the war immediately, but it shattered the Ottomans' ability to mount meaningful resistance on the Hungarian front. Combined with their diplomatic isolation, as France moved toward a separate peace with the European powers, while Russia had just captured Azov, Istanbul had little choice but to seek peace. For the first time in its history of negotiations with Europe, the Ottoman Empire agreed to enter negotiations, music, as the side that had suffered a devastating defeat rather than the side imposing its own terms. The negotiations mediated by England and the Dutch Republic continued for several months and concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Karlowitz on January 26, 1699 in the town of Karlowitz, now Sremski Karlo, Serbia. Under the terms of the treaty, the Ottoman Empire was forced to cede most of Hungary and Transylvania to the Habsburgs, territories they had controlled for more than a century and a half. Poland, Lithuania regained Podolia. The Republic of Venice received the Mora and part of Delatia. As for Russia, the agreement concerning Azov was confirmed in a separate treaty music, signed shortly afterward. In essence, Karlowitz marked a structural turning point, not merely an isolated defeat. For the first time in its history, the Ottoman Empire was forced to surrender a vast amount of territory through a peace treaty negotiated according to the European diplomatic model rather than imposing its own terms as it had done throughout the previous 3 centuries. It officially brought the era of continuous Ottoman expansion toward the west to an end, an era that had twice brought their armies to the gates of Vienna. For the Habsburg Empire, Zenta and Karlowitz became the foundation from which it emerged as the leading continental power in Central Europe, a position it would maintain for centuries until the First World War. And for Eugene of Savoy, the victory at Zenta was only the opening chapter. He would remain one of Europe's most influential military commanders for decades afterward, helping to shape the course of both the War of the Spanish Succession and the later wars against the Ottomans themselves. But everything that followed from the peace treaty and the rise of the Habsburgs to Eugene's legendary reputation began with a single afternoon on the banks of the Tisza River, where an army was caught in the middle of crossing a river and a pontoon bridge of 60 boats collapsed beneath the weight of the very men who depended on it for survival. If you enjoy in-depth historical content, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support us. Thank you for watching, and we will see you